Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to the Thursday CME of South Delhi Pediatric Study Group. Today, the topic for today's CME is Common Pediatric Dermatology Disorders. The session shall be chaired by Dr. MC Gupta. Sir is a renowned pediatrician in South Delhi. He is attached to Max Saket and Rainbow Hospital. I'll request Sir to kindly introduce the speaker and chair the session.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Sangal. Good evening, everyone, and happy monsoon. Today's speaker is Dr. Mankul Goel. He is a pediatric and adult dermatologist, and he holds interest and expertise in treating conditions like skin allergies. Am I audible? Skin allergies, atopic dermatitis, acne, vitiligo, hemangioma with holistic approach for treating chronic skin conditions. He is graduate from AIMS, and he did MD also from AIMS in 2014. And after that, he did fellowship in dermatoendocrinology from Dessau Medical Center, Germany in 2016. And he has diploma in integrated medicines from Cape Town in 2018. He is also a member of the Quantum Institute of Wellbeing, which deals with the holistic medicine like livings and dietary management of various chronic diseases. So today he'll speak on common pediatric dermatological problem. Welcome, Dr. Mankul.
Thank you, Dr. MC Gupta, for your kind introduction, and thank you, South Delhi IAP, for giving me the opportunity to speak to all of you, share whatever little I know about dermatology and pediatric dermatology. I hope I'm reasonably audible to all of you. Please do interrupt, and Dr. Sankalp, if I'm not, please interrupt me and let me know in between.
You're audible. You're audible.
Yeah, thank you. So talking about dermatology, pediatric dermatology to pediatricians, I was wondering while deciding the topic whether I should go in details of one disorder or go in, touch upon a little bit on various disorders. But finally, I thought to move on and create a presentation with the major intent of understanding the correlations between the outer skin disorders and their systemic correlates, which I think would be the most interesting for the pediatricians. And I have not focused too much on the treatment, but obviously in the discussion part, we can talk about things if you would like about something. So we start, and so we start with atopic dermatitis. Firstly, with the presentation of atopic dermatitis. So we know of the typical flexiular pattern where it happens on the cubital fossa, popliteal fossa, the wrist areas. But it can present in other forms as well, like nummular or discoid patterns where there's sort of circular patches only in certain areas of the body, limbs, and trunk. And so it doesn't represent as a classical diagnosis, and sometimes then we have differential diagnosis, most commonly of fungal infections or a contact dermatitis or a psoriasis. So they need to be considered, but generally symmetry is helpful. Certain other signs are very helpful in differentiating between nummular, the ooziness of the lesions helps differentiate between the two. Then prurigo nodularis, not so common in children, but can happen if the child is constantly engaging in the itch scratch cycle. So they can actually become scaly, nodular, blackish kind of nodules in the especially in the limb areas of the body. It generally denotes the chronicity of the process. The third presentation, which we see often, is erythrodermic, where the whole body becomes red and scaly. And it can be a common end result of various other disorders like psoriasis, seborrheic dermatitis, drug reactions, or pityriasis rubra pilaris. But I think atopic dermatitis is by far the most common cause behind erythrodermic presentation in children. Sometimes we see lichenoid lesions where the lesions are more blackish in color. And then we have, on the right hand side, follicular or papular dermatitis, where they're just little small dotted kind of lesions all over the body. And there we have to differentiate it from keratosis pilaris, which is generally limited to arms or thighs, or rhinoderma, which is more in the frictional areas, behind the elbows and knees areas, lichen spinulosus, lichen nitidus. And then there is pemphigus or dyshydrosiform eczema, where there are just vesicles on the palms and soles. Then we have a face presentation where the lesions are majorly limited to head and neck. There we strongly suspect, and it has been shown that many of those cases are seborrheic in nature, or there is a high level of IgE antibody against malassezia in such cases. And there is eczematous cheilitis, where there is the inflammation of the lips. So one has to look at the if there is a braces or the toothpaste or other things which are being used by the child, the chewing gum or other things which may be contributing to it. And then there is eyelid dermatitis. So the whole idea of bringing up this whole presentation is that many a times it's not the classic one, and we see chronic lesions appearing in these forms, and we do wonder if this is atopic dermatitis or something else. But these can be as a standalone presentations of atopic dermatitis also, and hence counseling about the chronic recurrent nature of these is important to the patient. And obviously when we see these kinds of presentations, each one have some unique external or local factors which need to be addressed, as we discussed. So sharing a little bit on the pathophysiology of atopic dermatitis. So right at the top and the right hand side corner, we see filaggrin, which is like, if the skin is like a brick wall, then it's the proteins which help adhere the bricks, or the cement, which is very important. And then other key ingredients like ceramides, long chain fatty acids, and antimicrobial peptides. So what has been shown that all of these go down. Some of these go down because of genetic causes, but a key factor is the Th2 part of immune system, interleukin 4, interleukin 30, interleukin 31, creating an inflammation in the skin, and all these factors going down. And at the same time, the nervous system has a major role to play, as you can see right next to it. So stressed kids or various other factors, high functioning kids. There is a saying about atopic dermatitis that 10% of the world population has atopy, and 90% of the world leaders have atopic dermatitis. So it's the high functioning hyperactive nervous system which also stress plays a significant role. So these afferent sensory nerve fibers, artemin, which make the person feel very itchy. So that also breaks down the barrier. And then there is the third factor, which is the microbes. Staphylococcus aureus is one of the key microbes in atopic dermatitis. It comes and colonizes the skin, and once it colonizes the skin, it releases a lot of toxins which break down the skin barrier. And once it further breaks down the skin barrier, it also triggers a Th2 immune response. And it is sort of a vicious cycle, because for interleukin 4 plays a major role in the binding of Staphylococcus aureus. So high levels of IL-4 has been associated with more Staphylococcus aureus binding in the skin, and more colonization of staph. And then increase in staph causes an aggravation of the allergic tendency within the system as well. And other arms of immune system like Th17, Th1 are also triggered. So a vicious cycle of microbes, nervous system, genetic factors, and immune factors playing a significant role, and then malassezia, dust mite, viruses, and allergens. So this is a broad overview of the pathophysiology of atopic dermatitis. From this pathophysiology, some key therapeutic basic points are, the importance of antimicrobials. So we see a lot of kids with a head and neck um, type atopic dermatitis respond well to antifungals. A general body atopic dermatitis respond better to antibiotics. And then obviously we don't want to affect the biodiversity of the microbiome by giving too many antibiotics. So we have local options like nasal mupirocin and potassium permanganate baths, bleach baths, which can be very useful. And so that's one aspect, taking care of the antimicrobials. The second aspect is taking care of the itch scratch cycle. So many kids and parents, they feel that scratching will make things better for the child will feel more easy. But actually we end up making the issue, if it's 10, we keep making it 50. So counseling regarding that, and use of Syndex with pH of 5.5, using moisturizers within 3 minutes, house dust elimination, all these things are also useful. Another key aspect is the use of the topical steroids. So as we all know, topical steroids are double-edged, and they do make things better, and sometimes there is a temptation of using a stronger steroid. So I just put up on the right-hand side a whole list of the potency of the steroids. So lowest potency being class 7 and class 6, which in the class 7 includes hydrocortisone, which is the mildest, and also the natural steroid made in our system. And class 6 is clobetasone, commonly Umozome and Desonide. So it's good to majorly limit oneself within this range in most kids and use it for short durations because higher potency steroids, they further increase the microbial load. So if when we come off the topical steroids, the things get worse. And if it is used too much in the folds and on the face and some of these areas, the skin thins out, and rosacea and many other disorders, and obviously systemic absorption affecting the child's growth, and other issues can develop. Also, the withdrawal and dependency factors also come in. So it's good to limit oneself to the class 6 and class 7 as much as possible, or shift to tacrolimus, pimecrolimus as options. And if the child is not improving, looking at other factors which may not be working out, rather than using stronger and stronger steroids to clear up the child. We've started using some of the novel things like ozone, which is a very intelligent molecule. It doesn't harm the general biodiversity of the skin. It helps take care of the staph and other bacteria. There are a few studies available on ozone, and other natural substances can also be used in cases. So this is another key issue, and I'm sure all of you are well versed with it, is the sleep quality getting affected. That's one area which is a vicious cycle. If the sleep quality gets affected, then the stress levels go up and the growth gets impaired. And one of the key emphasis and counseling to the patient is that at no cost, the sleep of the child should be impaired. Some parents have a reservation in overtly aggressively treating atopic dermatitis because they feel that whatever we do is very temporary, but emphasizing the fact that at least that much treatment should be done, that the sleep of the child stays in order so that the child can grow properly, is imperative. There are studies on children given antihistamines and not given antihistamines in chronic atopic dermatitis. The histamine group sometimes have a better growth vis-a-vis the non-antihistamine group, pending a more more internal solution for atopic dermatitis. So this is a topic close to my heart, which is let food be thy medicine. And so what is the role of food allergy in atopic dermatitis? And it's a topic of debate, and there is a lot of variation in the studies on atopic dermatitis and role of food, where some studies almost nullifying the role of food creating a perception of 2 to 3% of atopic dermatitis having a food allergy component, whereas there's some studies which claim up to 70%. So there's a huge variation, and one of the key questions is why is there such a variation in food allergy studies in atopic dermatitis? So I've tried to enlist some of the common reasons. One of them is the key method to identify food allergies, or the best method is oral food challenge. And in oral food challenge, the reactions which are observed are generally of three kinds. One is immediate IgE mediated, which is within 1 or 2 hours, or then there is a late phase IgE mediated, which is 6 to 8 hours later. And then there is a delayed eczematous reaction, which happens after 48 hours, 72 hours also. So in most studies, it's the immediate response which is assessed. So it may not be a complete assessment. The second reason is that sometimes the effects of, especially in the delayed eczematous reaction situation, the elimination needs to be more prolonged. So at least 2 weeks or 3 weeks before we can challenge. So maybe many of the studies have not done elimination for so long. The third factor is that many of these atopic cases, when they are being challenged, they're already inflamed. So it's sometimes become difficult to differentiate whether the child is scratching more, the regions have aggravated, or they've aggravated for another reason. So it becomes a little challenging in that scenario. The fourth factor is that many a times there's more than one food which is involved in the process. And when more than one food is involved and you eliminate one in the challenge, you may not see a good result. And the key factor is that it is not such a linear association that milk is the cause of atopic dermatitis or wheat is the cause of atopic dermatitis. They're mostly like, adding fuel to the fire, or one of the key contributory factors. So when we look for linear associations, most of the times these oral food challenges are disappointing. Nevertheless, many people have taken care of these factors, have then come up with a higher prevalence of food allergy in atopic dermatitis. And one of the common ground on which everybody agrees is that cow's milk, hen's egg, peanut, wheat, soy, nuts, and fish are responsible for more than 90% of the food allergies. As discussed, the reaction can be immediate, late phase, and delayed. What is the role of skin prick tests? The key advantage of skin prick tests is that it has a reasonable negative predictive value. At least once you do the test, and if somebody is supposed to be allergic to a certain form of a food, you inject it. If they're not getting a wheal of flare, that has some value, that there is the likelihood of person being allergic to that food goes down, at least in the immediate and the late phase IgE mediated response. So that has a reasonable value. However, the specificity or the positive predictive value is not so good. So one has to combine it with the experiential evidence, the oral food challenge. What I tell patients is it just throws leads for us, and then we have to make a proper analysis and out of those leads. Same is true for serum specific IgE testing. It may or may not correlate. Another thing I say to every patient is no food allergy test is perfect by any means. So we just use it to throw up the leads. To circumvent some of the drawbacks, atopic patch testing has come up, wherein you take up these foods and you just put it on an occlusive layer patch and leave it on the skin for 24 to 48 hours and see for a delayed eczematous reaction on the skin. Again, a tedious task in infancy currently, and it's not well standardized. So those are the issues. And the oral food challenge can be double blind, where both the clinician and the subject doesn't know, single blind, where only the subject doesn't know, or it can be an open oral food challenge. Another key thing to rule out is celiac disease in any child with atopic dermatitis. We are surprised from time to time when it comes out positive. and I'm highly sensitive towards it, especially in cases with extensive atopic dermatitis. And many of these kids are growth retarded as well. So it's just good to rule it out. And it's many parents whose children's gut is absolutely silent. So they have atopic dermatitis on the skin, but there are no gut symptoms of loose motions, abdominal pain, constipation, or anything. So those parents, many of them haven't looked at the food allergy angle, or sometimes clinicians also ignore that angle. But we have to acknowledge that sometimes the gut is silent and they just expresses on the skin. So currently, what do we practice in our clinic, considering the limitations of a private practice? What we do is most of the cases of extensive atopic dermatitis, we put them on a 2-week 6-food elimination diet, where we just completely eliminate wheat, milk, and milk products, and egg, and nuts, and soy, and um, bread or yeast-based products for 2 weeks. So it seems very radical, but I'm surprised from time to time how willing the parents of kids with extensive atopic dermatitis are to do that. And what is the benefit of that is if the child improves in 2 weeks, then it becomes a sort of a given that yes, the food has a role to play. Which food in what form can be decided later, but definitely food is playing a role. And then we can individually challenge after that every 3-4 days, where sometimes we are able to clearly pinpoint, sometimes we're not able to clearly pinpoint, but it does add value and understanding to patient's life and the clinician's practice. The key question which arises is, why do we eliminate all the foods suddenly? So there are two major reasons for that. One is the limitation of willpower. If we go one by one, then by the third or fourth food, everybody just sort of gives up. So it's easier for people to comprehend that it's okay, it's only for 2 weeks and we have to go all out. The second reason is many a times kids are allergic to more than one food. When you're allergic to more than one food, then if you eliminate one by one, you won't get the results. And I think 30% of the cases have more than one food. So there it is very useful as well. Next topic is the probiotics, in atopic dermatitis. Again, hygiene hypothesis we're all aware of, and the role of the mother's microbiome, the child's microbiome, how they're linked to each other. And but the topic is still in infancy. There are some probiotics which are useful and some which have not shown to be useful. And so I like to use them with some degree of faith, but as all of us, we don't know to what degree they're helping as of now. Coming to the next topic, which is very common situation, is hypopigmentary disorders. And the key differential diagnosis commonly that arise for us is vitiligo, nevus pigmentosus, nevoid hypomelanosis, malassezia-induced hypopigmentation, and topical steroid-induced hypopigmentation. In fact, these two go hand in hand, and mostly these are kids being treated for seborrheic dermatitis, and malassezia releases chemicals which create a hypopigmentation, and then topical steroid further aggravates the hypopigmentation. So they become a common differential. So does pityriasis alba or any form of post-inflammatory hypopigmentation. Lichen sclerosis atrophicalis can be seen in girls in the vulval area as well, or the anal area. So that also arises as a differential. So our useful aids in differentiating our examination, the history, and Woods lamp is very useful, and how they evolve over time. So nevus pigmentosus, the key differentiating point is the feathery margins that it has, and it is not completely depigmented, it's more hypopigmented. The issue or challenge arises between segmental vitiligo and nevoid depigmentosus. So one has to differentiate between the two in many cases, and feathery margins, segmental fashion, presence of white hair and vitiligo, or islands of normal skin and segmental vitiligo are some of the key features which help us differentiate. Nevoid hypomelanosis more appears like a Blaschkoid or in whorls or a linear pattern. So it's relatively easier to differentiate from the others. So this is a general broad overview to if one has to look at all the hypomelanosis in children. And here we can discuss the localized ones. So one can differentiate first on Wood's light if it's completely depigmented or hypopigmented, or it is not a pigmentary disorder. In depigmented ones, if there is a white forelock, if it's congenital, then we look at pyvalvidism and Waardenburg and other depending on systemic correlates. If it's acquired, and then we look at generalized vitiligo and other things. And hypopigmented, obviously, we look at tuberous sclerosis, nevus depigmentosus, post-inflammatory, infectious, and the other causes. Nevus animicus is a vascular malformation which appears hypopigmented, but if you on dioscopy, one can differentiate. Beer spots are, white patches on the hands, which are because of venous congestion. So they increase when the hands become dependent, and if you raise the hands of a child, then they sort of disappear. So most common out of these is vitiligo. And so I've taken this, the key triggering factors to vitiligo can be any major physical or psychological stress, intercurrent infections, and repeated antibiotic intake. So that has also been associated with vitiligo. Repeated antibiotic intake, the gut microbial diversity getting affected. Coebnerization is a phenomena where any sites of trauma like sunburn can also be impacted. One of the key mechanisms of development of vitiligo is, thiols, phenols, catechol. Many of these chemicals present in a lot of products, from chewing gums to latex rubber, sandals to dyes to phenol used to clean the floor, to a lot of other things, coloring agents. They're present, and they sort of are chemically similar to tyrosine, which is a precursor to melanin. So our body absorbs these, and they get into the place of tyrosine as a precursor in formation of the melanin pathway. But since they are not the same structure, they end up creating confusion within the melanocyte and triggering oxidative stress, which creates vitiligo. Then malnutrition, intake of preserved, stale, junk food also plays a significant role and can trigger vitiligo. There are lots of theories. There is no one clear theory on why does vitiligo happen, pathophysiology. But the most well supported is the recent data supports the vitiligo is a T-cell mediated autoimmune disease triggered by oxidative stress. So once the oxidative stress is triggered and the melanocyte sort of goes into oxidative stress, then the immune attack starts. Common associations of vitiligo can be alopecia areata, atopic dermatitis, autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Autoimmune thyroid disease is very common with vitiligo. Type 1 diabetes mellitus can happen. Inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, pemphigus, pernicious anemia is another common association. And apart from that, others. Again, in interest of the pediatricians, there is a study from Germany where, they found more often celiac disease in the patients of vitiligo. And they recommend that celiac specific antibodies should be determined during routine blood work in vitiligo patients. And in case of a positive result, a biopsy can be done. If celiac disease is unlikely, a trial of gluten-free diet for a specific time should nevertheless be discussed with individuals affected by vitiligo, because repigmentation appears possible. Because celiac is it's obviously not a it's not something which is like 0 or 1. There can be spectrum, there can be non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So what we have observed in many patients that even though if they're not celiac, putting them on gluten-free diet can actually ease out the system and help in repigmentation in vitiligo as well. And it's not funny how we discover kids, and Dr. Sankalp will share the story of one nurse in her NICU who was whose daughter was taking treatment for for vitiligo for 2 years, and she was going through a special school because she couldn't perform in the regular school. And we just she came to me and we just happened to check for celiac, and she was positive. And then her life changed. Her from steroids she moved to very minimal treatment for vitiligo, and B, her mental performance obviously improved, and she was shifted to normal schools and studies. So obviously all the pediatricians know how gratifying it is to identify celiacs, and this is one of the windows, both vitiligo and alopecia areata, which are associated with autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome. They share the same genetic basis. It's good to just check in all of those cases. Certain differences between childhood vitiligo and adult onset vitiligo are, in children we see more segmental or dermatomal variants, which means that the lesions are limited to the distribution of one nerve only. More prevalence of halonevi, where we see moles and whiteness around them. And there is a stronger family history of autoimmune disease if it happens right from childhood. There is a routine workup of vitiligo, which I have taken up from Dr. Lotti, who is one of the leaders in vitiligo treatments in Italy and all over the world. He's one of the persons leading the vitiligo research in the world. And so this is one the kind of panel they do for every vitiligo patient, which is TPO-TGA antibodies, parietal gastric cell antibody, IgE, ANA, and other antibodies, TSH, eosinophil count, B12, and folic acid. So this is about some things about vitiligo. I'm not going to too much into the treatment bit. It's a whole new subject and whole topic in itself. Moving to alopecia areata, so this line signifies the importance of this disorder. Onset of alopecia areata is before the age of 14. 70 to 80% of those affected, and significant number, 48%, will present within this condition during their first and second decades, making it the most common cause of hair loss in otherwise healthy children. So this is another table showing the disorders associated with alopecia areata, autoimmune thyroiditis, again being common, vitiligo, pernicious anemia, celiac, autoimmune polyendocrine. And some of the common comorbidities are atopy, low serum ferritin, serum zinc being low, vitamin D being low. And this is one disorder which is very much strongly linked to stress. So many times we hear stories of kids starting the school, not feeling comfortable, developing a patch, or going to an exam and during exams developing a patch and then it healing off. So this is one disorder which is very much linked, and even in therapies, hypnotherapy, if you just type hypnotherapy and alopecia areata, there are numerous studies on PubMed. So here is one study done on mice, which sort of gives some support to this issue, where in the mice they took normal mice and alopecia areata mice, and they studied the cortisol levels in response to acute stress and repeated stress at a hematological level. So they found that in both the scenarios, the acute and repeated stress, both the cortisol and ACTH levels were higher in the alopecia areata group. The black being alopecia areata ACTH, and here cortisol being higher than the normal group. And this is another interesting study done at a peripheral level. So this is the hematological, and this is at the periphery at the skin level. So the A, or the top image here, I don't know how much you can see this, but I'll just explain it in words. This A image basically shows, these are basically immunohistochemistry images, where they've tried to stain for cortisol releasing hormone receptor. This is a normal scalp and normal skin hair roots. Ignore the black part, that is the hair, but there is no staining of the releasing hormone receptors in the periphery. Whereas this is the alopecia areata patient's skin, scalp skin. And here there is a very good or high uptake of the cortisol releasing hormone receptor. The bottom line is that both at a central level and at a peripheral level, the body is more prone to stress related side effects. And if there's one condition where it is most prominently seen, it is alopecia areata, and both clinically and lab wise. Here is a new study in 2020 done, which is also relevant to COVID times, because we are seeing women with aggressive hair loss like anything in this period. And apart from post-COVID telogen effluvium, one of the key factors is stress. And in this study, they have taken the dermal papilla, which is basically let's say the root of the hairs. These are some mesenchymal cells which are present in the root of the hair follicle. And what they've demonstrated is that once the cortisol releasing hormone gets attached, just like there is a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, there is a whole hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis present in the root of the hair. So there is the formation of the DNA of pro-opium, melanocortin, and ACTH and cortisol within the dermal papillary cells. And the result of this increased ACTH and cortisol is that the anagen phase or the growing phase of the hair is shortened and the catagen and the telogen phase is increased. So that leads to increased hair fall and worsening of the hair related conditions. So it's very important then to address the stress part directly than to beat around the bushes. Few brief words on infantile seborrheic dermatitis and diaper rash. Again, to emphasize the point, to minimize the use of strong steroids, staying mostly limited to group 6 and group 7, and minimizing the duration of topical steroids, more often use of antifungals and emollients, taking care of the gut microbiome of mother and child, and if the child is not getting better, taking care of the other factors, refraining from the temptation to show immediate results, which ultimately becomes counterproductive because both the fungi and antibiotic become more potent in response to steroids. The efflux pumps become more potentized and they are more drug resistant after use of steroids. So it's about, if the child is not responding, taking care of the other factors more often, the oiling aspect and the other aspects, humidity, occlusion, overclothing, sweating, rather than pumping in steroids. Same for the diaper rash as well, minimizing the same and taking care of the factors is really helpful. Coming to the last topic for discussion, urticaria, and Dr. Rajiv Khandelwal was talking about how it is increased at this point of time, and it's a constant challenge every year for us to deal with urticaria patients. Obviously, we know of the two types of urticaria. One is acute and chronic. Less than 6 weeks, it just goes up in a peak and then it comes down. So the patients and the parents just need the counseling that's going to come down. And most of the times it's acute, and in acute cases, mostly infectious, viruses, bacteria as mentioned here, and parasites contributing to it, or some medication like beta-lactams, or there are some direct mast cell degranulation medicines, aspirin and NSAIDs, increase the leukotrienes, and vancomycin opiates can directly degranulate the mast cells. So those can be the reasons. Then there are food allergens, specific food allergens, or pseudo-allergens. Pseudo-allergens are basically, there is a patients who come to us who are not responding at all to urticaria. We always give a try of a pseudo-allergen-free diet, where they stop all preservatives, all packaged foods, and we are very often not so surprised that their urticaria improves. This is more in reference to chronic urticaria, but also a useful commonsensical strategy for acute urticaria to ask the patients to stop all the packaged foods while they have urticaria. We don't want to add fuel to the fire. Insect envenomation can also be a cause. Physical urticaria, heat, cold pressure, very common cholinergic urticaria where children report the temperature going up, their body become hot, and then there are little wheals, small pinpoint kind of lesions. Rarely solar urticaria, aeroallergens, contact allergens, and obviously autoimmune disorders, mastocytosis, lymphomas, and rarely hereditary periodic fever syndromes have to be considered. This is one of the protocols that I picked up from one of the papers, and obviously if the average wheals duration is more than 24 hours, you consider vasculitis. It's less than arterial vasculitis, less than 24 hours. You have to see if there is a physical urticaria or it's a food or a drug. It's mostly commonsensical stuff. We consider complement testing majorly in isolated angioedema, where there is basically we're suspecting bradykinin induced, not histamine induced. The key way to differentiate is if the child has more redness, itching, and all these things, then they are more histamine induced. So unlikely to be complement C4, C1 INH driven. But if they're bland, painful, more subcutaneous swellings, then one should bear angioedema testing in mind. If all these things are recommended negative, then again, I was surprised to see celiac thyroid disorders is also mentioned everywhere in the world, should also be ruled out, CRP, ESR, and there can be autologous serum testing. Treatment options, oral steroids, antihistamines, leukotriene inhibitors, antibiotics, deworming, immunomodulators of various types, can be used, cyclosporin and others. Supplements like vitamin C, zinc, vitamin D, omega-3/6 have a very good role in the COX and leukotriene axis, dietary modifications, ketotifen, and there are other strategies if there is a chronic urticaria. But acute urticaria mostly needs a symptomatic management, wait and watch, and support to the family, counseling them that as scary as it looks like, it is as benign. So thank you so much. And I'm grateful that I had this opportunity to speak to all of you. Would like to hear if there are any questions or any feedbacks or anything you would like to say. Most welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Makul, for a nice talk and a detailed insight on atopic dermatitis with holistic approach for dietary management and each and everything other than use of steroids and management of vitiligo, atopic alopecia areata, and management of infantile seborrheic dermatitis. So over to Dr. Sankalp for any questions.
So there are a few questions in the chat box.
All right, let me just see.
So one is by Dr. Neha Joshi, thoughts on how to address and approach premature graying of hair in children and adolescents.
Right. So premature graying, two key factors is one is oxidative stress. It's a major player. The research done on premature graying, oxidative stress plays a major role. Any factor which will increase that will play a role. But more specifically speaking, iron deficiency, B12 deficiency is one key cause. There is, in almost all the cases, family history as well of premature graying. When we talk about premature graying and oxidative stress, the key
I think the voice is breaking. Is it breaking for everyone, or there's a problem at my end?
And I would say 90% there is a very strong family history. And then there is, of course,
Norita, please wait. बुला ले आजा, तू भी आजा। नोनिता आ जाओ, यहीं ले आओ उसको भी।
Ask a
yes,
question.
please, madam.
Dr. Mankul, could you give us some just practical tips on adolescent skin once they start developing acne? So,
So I think generally the adolescent acne happens on the forehead and the T-zone. They start expressing like a blackhead and a whitehead pattern here, and a bit of, whiteheads and blackheads here in this area. And what is useful is to, take care of their dandruff. Even before, girls start their periods, or men start growing, the moment their DHEAS starts going up, they start developing a oiliness of the scalp and a bit of dandruff, and this starts to appear. So helping clear their dandruff and using a gentle face wash, which will help clear up the oil. Cetaphil products are reasonably good, or Sebamed products for face washes. And then followed by that, just a gentle thin moisturizer. There are some acne non-comedogenic moisturizers, gel-based, and so those can be used. To name a few, I prefer, something like Sit Moist or an Acne Moist moisturizer. So these can be used depending on the skin type. And then if there are, small little lesions, a bit of a salicylic acid-based ointment can just help open up the pores, which might be good enough. And a little bit of gentle use of retinoid might be good enough. So these are some tips, and otherwise there is clindamycin and benzoyl peroxide, but one has to select carefully. Clindamycin and benzoyl peroxide, one has to be a little careful because it can irritate the skin. And if the child has a heavy dandruff, then antifungals might be useful. And of course, the biggest service you can do to the child and the parent is to make them aware that how their diet is contributing to it. A heavy milk-laden diet, sugar, milk, refined carbohydrate-based diet will immediately increase the load of fungus in the gut. So the gut-brain skin axis becomes quite active. So it just helps to have a fiber-rich, good fats-based diet. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Uh, we don't have any more questions, so I think we can bring the session to a close. So thank you so much, Dr. Mankul Goel, for an excellent talk and giving us a comprehensive overview of pediatric skin disorders. And it is really an eye-opener that how much of skin openers are actually associated with stress or with some systemic disorders, especially celiac and others. And thank you so much. And we hope to meet you again sometime, and we with some other talk. Thank you, Dr. M.C. Gupta, for chairing the session and taking our time for us.
Thank you, Dr. MC.
Thank you all delegates for joining in large numbers, and hope to see you again next Thursday. Till then, good night, Shabba khair. Bye-bye, everybody.